afternoon and welcome. I'm glad to see this beautiful day because this event was scheduled for some time ago and was delayed because of a snowstorm on the day it was supposed to happen. No snowstorm in sight today, finally. Thanks for coming out on such a beautiful day and being with us. Today's theme is the question, is capitalism a caring society? Economists engage in the thought of Pope Francis. Let me introduce our distinguished guest speakers. Robert Whaples is professor of economics at Wake Forest University. He is co-editor of the Independent Review, which is a well-known and highly regarded journal of political economy. He has recently edited or co-edited 6 books, including the Routledge Handbook of Modern Economic History. He teaches Introduction to Economics, Current Economic Issues, Environmental and Natural Resources Economics, and the Economics of Entrepreneurship. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and an item that is pertinent to this particular lecture, in which our guests engage in the thought of St. Francis, Pope Francis. He and his wife Regina are lay Dominicans. My dear old friend Sam Gregg, I'm just delighted to have Samuel Gregg back with us here, is research director at the Acton Institute and a fellow of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. He's written and spoken extensively on questions of political economy, economic history, ethics in finance, and natural law theory. Among his 11 books are the 2013 book, Becoming Europe, and the 2016 book, For God and Profit, subtitled How Banking and Finance Can Serve the Common Good. He holds an MA in Political Philosophy from the University of Melbourne and a doctorate in Philosophy at EPhil in Moral Philosophy and Political Economy from Oxford University. I will ask Professor Whaples to speak first, and then Dr. Gregg. Please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Whaples.
So hopefully everyone received a copy of my almost everything I'm going to say, which was out near the door. But essentially what I'd like to do is explore the question of whether capitalism is a caring society. I envision this as a dialogue that would take place between economists and Pope Francis. And I'll attempt not to put words into Pope Francis's mouth. As often as possible, I will use direct passages, especially from Laudato Si. So let's just begin by thinking about what capitalism is. We know that it's an economic system in which the resources, land, and the labor, the physical capital, are owned and operated and traded for the purposes of generating profits or other gains by private individuals. Okay? So the big decisions about investment, production, pricing, distribution, the goods and services that are going to be produced, those decisions are made by private individuals in a very decentralized marketplace. Something you could compare capitalism to, obviously, is socialism, where many of those resources and many of those decisions then are made by the collectivity, the state, instead of those individuals. So let's begin the discussion with the economists weighing in and thinking about capitalism at its best. Okay? At its best, it's a system that can give us things we want, like efficiency, growth, freedom, creativity. Capitalism, I am told, is a word that was originally a pejorative, and it still is to many people. But think about the root word for capitalism, capita. It's about your head. It's about using your head as far as the economist is concerned. So what does capitalism do at its best? Let me begin with ideas, say, from Friedrich Hayek about how it can solve the three big problems that we need to allocate our resources. First, it can solve the knowledge problem. I have some resources. I don't really know how valuable those resources are. I don't really know what's the best thing to do with those resources. And so I live in a hut somewhere out in the boondocks somewhere, and I discover this piece of metal, and it's shiny, and it's very pretty, and people will say, oh, that's so pretty, what are you going to do with it? And it's got this golden color to it. I'm not quite sure what the best thing to do with it. I got a hole in the roof of my hut. It's been leaking. And I noticed this stuff can be hammered out, very fine sheet. Nice protection against the elements. Okay, so that's what I do with it. And someone comes by and says to me, you idiot, do you realize how valuable that gold is? And I'm like, no. And they begin to explain to me how valuable it is as shown by its price. And you may scoff at this example, but the first big gold nugget discovered in the United States was used as a doorstop for years before the hillbilly out in the middle of North Carolina was apprised of what its value was. Okay? And so the knowledge problem, I've got resources, I don't really know how valuable they are and how valuable they are to other people, and that if I trade with them, I might be able to get so much that I could build myself a new hut or a nice house instead of living in a hut, once I figure out how valuable those. And so it's prices that are sending this signal to us about how valuable our resources are. The second thing that a capitalist market economy can do is it can solve the incentive problem. I've got resources, we've got resources, we want to make sure those resources don't get wasted. And if they're owned collectively, it's quite possible that they're going to get wasted. If I own them individually, if we own them individually, we have a very strong incentive not to waste those resources. Third, there's the learning problem. Okay. Am I putting my resources into a good use? I don't know until I try. And the market sends me a signal again about how well I put them. And that signal is called profit. If I put them to a highly valued use, I will earn more profits. The higher valued uses I can figure out to put them to, the more profit I get. If I end up putting them to low valued uses, I'll get losses. And those who rack up losses will be pushed aside, and those who earn profits will expand, but they'll also be copied by other people. And so we'll end up putting our resources into very highly valued uses. And the second thing the economist says, capitalism is best, is because capitalism solves these problems so well, it's going to accelerate technological improvement, it's going to raise standards of living, it's going to eliminate absolute poverty. Life expectancy will get longer, education levels will rise, our leisure time will improve, the rich will get richer, and the poor will get richer too. That's the history of market economy. Number 3, capitalism at its best. Okay? Capitalism achieves these results without coercion. It increases freedom. It's less violent than so many of the alternatives. It promotes cooperation and harmony of interest, both within firms and across firms with supply chain, but also between buyers and sellers. Capitalism at its best, number 4 on my list, is that capitalism actually diffuses power. Rather than concentrating the power, say, in the hands of the central authority, as alternatives do, capitalism actually diffuses power. And it's so easy for us to miss this because we see these big businesses. And they seem like they just keep getting bigger and bigger. But in fact, that's not really the history. In fact, most of the gains from the technological improvements that these capitalists come up with end up getting passed along to the consumers. William Nordhaus, in an excellent NBER working paper a few years ago, tried to calculate in recent years the percentage of the technological improvements that get captured as profits by the capitalists and how much gets passed on to the consumers. And he said about 97.8% gets passed on to the consumers, and that sounds about right. Okay, so most of it goes to the consumers. Capitalism doesn't generally tend toward monopoly, the economist says in its best case, unless the state is there to block the entry of new firms, because if firms were to merge together and try to form monopolies, right, other firms would then smell the profits that have increased, and they'd come in getting attracted to those markets. Capitalism, in its best phase, unleashes creativity. Okay? And so think of the poster child for creativity in modern years. Steve Jobs. Imagine Steve Jobs living in his father's country, living in Syria instead of in the United States? How would his life have been different? How would his abilities, his creative abilities have played out differently? Pretty differently, I think. In fact, Joseph Schumpeter, the prophet of capitalism, if you will, makes the case that the entrepreneurs behind the capitalist system are really artists. They're really virtuoso. He compares them to Enrico Caruso, the great operatic tenor, in their artistry in solving these problems and being creative. So capitalism allows people to do that, and in the process, to lead more meaningful lives. Okay, so we have laid out the best case scenario for capitalism. Okay, maybe we've overstated things in some cases. Let's have Pope Francis come back in. And I think Francis would begin by saying, let's not misstate capitalism's ultimate purpose, which is not profits, or overstate its virtues or ignore its problems. So Francis would put it this way. He says, business, capitalism, is a noble profession directed to producing wealth and improving our world. It can be a fruitful source of prosperity for the areas in which it operates, especially if it sees the creation of jobs as an essential part of its service to the common good. The broader objective of helping the poor should always be to allow them a dignified life through work. So there's the end of this whole system, not profits, but people, and especially the most vulnerable of those people. Okay, so point by point, let's see what Francis would say back to what the economists have said about capitalism, and then we'll have the economists rebut some of the things that Francis said. So I think Francis would say, true, capitalism incentivizes people to reduce costs, but to reduce private costs. It also gives them an incentive to ignore those social costs, those costs that you can push on to other people. It doesn't solve very well problems like pollution, for example, or common pool resource problems. Classic case being fish swimming out in the middle of the ocean that nobody owns. So, the environment, he says, is one of those goods that cannot be adequately safeguarded or promoted by market forces. Business profits by calculating and paying only a fraction of the costs involved. Economic costs must be fully borne by those who incur them. Second, I think the Pope would say, because these capitalist economies have solved that problem, he said, and they produce so much that the external damages often rise as output levels rise. Think about more automobiles, that means more pollution. It just seems like those markets have an unslakable thirst for so many resources, especially those common pool resources. Think about the way we have overfished the seas. Better fishing, yeah, great for the economy, great for the capitalists, earn better profits, and you end up catching all the fish out there and there's none left for future generations. So he argues the economy seems to accept every advance in technology with a view to profit without concern for its potential negative impacts on human beings. Third, I think, Pope Francis would say, capitalism is producing more than the earth can sustain. We are using up resources and leaving too few for the future. Here's what he says in Laudato Si. We all know that it's not possible to sustain the present level of consumption in developed countries and wealthier sectors of society where the habit of wasting and discarding has reached unprecedented levels. The earth, our home, here's his most famous line from Laudato Si, is beginning to look more and more like an immense pile of filth. Okay, point number 4 from Pope Francis. Even if the excess production didn't damage the earth, it seems like many of us simply have too much for our own good. Many people in this room, perhaps, including myself. The market tends to promote, he says, extreme consumerism. People can easily get caught up in that whirlwind of needless buying and spending. Possessions are so, fill in the blank, are so dangerous, says Francis, They lead you immediately to vanity, and you believe that you're important, and you believe you're so important your head swells and you become lost. Perhaps he would quote Proverbs 30 verses 8 and 9, lines that I quote every year in my introduction to economics class, where the prayer is offered, give me neither poverty nor riches, neither poverty nor riches. Provide me only with the food that I need, lest being full I deny thee, saying, who is the Lord? Or being in want, I steal and profane the name of my God. Then Pope Francis says, the time has come for us to accept decreased economic growth in some parts of the world, this part, and to encourage more sober lifestyles. It's a matter of redefining our notion of progress, he says in Laudato Si. Okay, next thing that Francis would say, I think, is that capitalism generates high levels of economic inequality. We should be suspicious of the claim that things are getting better for the poor, he says. But even if the poor did get richer, along with the rich, wealth and income gaps are getting higher, and are higher than they would be under alternative arrangements. The rich flaunt their wealth, and they marginalize those at the bottom. The rich are so far removed from the poor, with little direct contact with their problems, the rich vainly show off their possessions and their supposed superiority, says Francis. I think a sixth point Francis would make is that capitalism feeds on envy. Don't believe me? Every car commercial you have ever seen, just about, right, is about showing up the competition, showing up the neighbor. Advertisements just celebrate us for doing better than everybody else and play on those anxieties, setting up those zero-sum status competitions. They make envy the norm. Seventh point that Francis would make. Capitalism lures people into focusing on crass material things and frenetic activity, as he calls it, rather than on the important things, especially on spiritual matters and personal relationships. Capitalism panders to our worst nature. It certainly does. Sex sells, we know that, and this permeates and degrades our society. Capitalism allows people to get bad things for bad reasons. Don't forget the extremes to which capitalism goes. Pornographers are capitalists. Abortionists are capitalists. And he might point to this evidence. I don't think he's seen it, but he might point to this evidence. The Pew Research Center, and this is the first of my numbers at the back, so turn one sheet back, has collected data from people around the world, and we can plot that out. We can see the percentage of people in each country who report that religion is very important to them in comparison to their level of income per capita in the country. And if you just see those dots on it, you can see the strong negative relationship there. The United States, fortunately, is the richest country here, but also a big outlier where we are more religious than other rich countries are. Okay, but look at the numbers. Okay, you get rich. Who is the Lord? Point number 8. Francis would put it this way. How can we listen to the words of love amid the constant noise, the interminable, the nerve-wracking distractions that capitalism gives us? Point number 8 for Francis. Capitalism overemphasizes the individual to the detriment of the collectivity. It erodes social capital and communal bonds. Markets increase anonymous interactions, and people become part of just commodity chains instead of building purposeful relationships with their neighbors. The emphasis on success and self-reliance, he says, does not appear to favor an investment in efforts to help the slow, the weak, or the less talented find the opportunities in life. Point number 9 from Francis. Capitalism tends to put a price tag on everything. I gave this talk at a conference, Napa Institute conference over the summer, and who should sit down at the same table as me but Pete Kors? I'm like, how much is that guy worth? What's the net worth? How many zeros isn't that what we start to do in a capital? And there's a lot fewer zeros behind a minimum wage worker's name. We put a price tag on everything in the capitalist system. Nothing's sacred anymore. Point number 10 of Francis. Workers and the poor often get exploited by capitalism. They don't get their fair share. Employers begin to view them as mere objects and dismiss them when they're not needed anymore. They pay them the lowest wages possible. They subject them to hard and unsafe working conditions. And new technology just keeps destroying jobs. We were created with a vocation to work. Work is a necessity. Jesus worked with his hands. Imagine the carpenters all getting tossed out of work. Okay, point number 9. Capitalism is plagued by booms and busts. Don't need to elaborate on that much. And point number 11. And point number 12. Capitalism is plagued by cronyism and rent seeking. The rich use their connections to get power from the state. Okay, so what can an economist say back to these important points that Francis has raised? I think the economist would say, let's not mischaracterize capitalism or overstate the problems or ignore the achievements. And your final point, Francis, about cronyism is spot on. Right? That's not good capitalism, that's not true capitalism. Unfortunately, maybe capitalism sometimes devolves into that, but that's the state running the show, and it's not true capitalism. So, let's think about some of the rebuttals. Start with the environmental critique. We all agree, every economist I've ever met agrees, that the polluter should pay. And we need to set up a system that makes the polluter pay. But you know who the polluter is? The polluter that's enjoying this light in this room and this air conditioning? It's all of us. So the consumer has to bear some of this. It's not just whoever your local utility is. No. And so there are ways to get the polluters to pay. They include things like charging what are called Pigouvian taxes. But another way to get people to solve these environmental problems and to get them to think long term and not abuse the resources of the world is in fact property. Property rights are so crucial because when you own property, you treat it a lot differently than when everybody owns it or somebody else owns it. So go to my next graphic. It's a view from the air of the border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And it's a pretty stark picture. On one side of the border, everything's brown, and on the other side, things are green. What gives? And the answer seems to be that property rights are not very secure in Haiti and have not been for a long time, because it's a government that's very corrupt. And if you were to own some land, you would think, what do I do with these trees? I could let them grow tall and harvest them 10, 20, 30, 50 years from now. Oh, but if I wait that long, the guys from the government are going to come in with their logging, and they're going to, and if it's not them, it'll be some friends of theirs. So I might as well cut it down before they get a chance, because my property's not secure. On the other side of the border, it's much more secure. And so you can think long-term and husband your resources. In fact, this long-termism means that we're actually not running out of resources. You can measure the scarcity of resources with this really important bit of information. It's called the price. And so you can look at prices of raw materials, and in the long run, most raw material prices are not rising. Take a look at the graphic in the middle of the back page. This is the Dow Jones AIG Commodity Index, and it's got all sorts of, industrial, natural resource commodities put together, resource commodities. We're looking at terms of decades here, and in comparison to the price of everything else, the commodities are actually getting cheaper. There's some spikes where they get more expensive, but they tend to be getting cheaper. And if you look at measures of things like estimated reserves of natural resources, including oil and natural gas, they are higher now than they were 40 years ago. So point number 7 that the economists are making in their rebuttal is that capitalism actually makes people wealthy enough that they can start to demand a cleaner environment. This is known amongst economists as the environmental Kuznets curve, and we flashed by it a second ago when we were on that back page. Here's a pollutant that we should all hate, and that is sulfur dioxide. You do not want to be breathing this in. Okay? And so this takes the United States as of 1900 and looks at multiples of our emissions of sulfur dioxide and multiples of our standard of living. Okay? And so the economy has grown a lot. And at first, the levels of pollution went up and up and up as we industrialized and got richer and richer. But then they reached a peak. And they have come down tremendously since then. I know this. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when I was a kid, I'd run around in the backyard. I lived in the Washington, D.C. area. I'd come in the summer, I'd be wheezing because there was so much smog in the air. And then we got richer, and we started making technological improvements and putting catalytic converters on our cars and stopped burning coal for our fuel and putting scrubbers in those coal smokestacks and switching to natural gas because we could afford to do it. And our pollution levels have come down across the board for the water pollutants and the air pollutants. And it's not just the United States, it's lots of countries. China has reached their peak and is coming down. Capitalism also allows more charity, says the economist, because it creates more wealth that then can be given. Capitalism incentivizes people to be more virtuous. Do you ever think of that? Because virtue pays. I mean, treating people nice, treating the customer nice pays. And you start treating people nice, and often you start turning into a nicer person. There's the incentive. Point number 10 of the economist. Capitalist markets are examples of how people can cooperate to solve problems. They encourage people to act in a more trustworthy manner and improve social ties and social harmony. And number 11, workers actually don't get exploited all that often in this market economy because they're mobile. If they're immobile, yes. But because they're mobile and have multiple job alternatives, you can't really have the employer steal all the value from the worker. In fact, if you look at standards of living of workers in countries like the United States and countries around the world, they have been rising. And so, point number 10, the inequality and absolute poverty around the world are actually decreasing now. The main measure of inequality, the Gini coefficient, has come down worldwide in the last few decades. And the World Bank uses this measure of absolute poverty, people living on less than $1.25 a day or $1.90 a day. And they have found that from 1990 to 2013, the number of people living in that absolute poverty has fallen from about 1.8 billion people worldwide to 770 million people worldwide. More than 1 billion fewer people living in absolute poverty, mainly in countries that turn toward market systems, with China, ironically, being probably the most famous of those cases. So there's the economist rebuttal. What does Pope Francis say in conclusion? Okay, and remember, this is a dialogue between the two. So Francis says things like this: there can be no ecology, and the root word for ecology and for economy are the same root, eco, oikos from Greek, the household. There can be no ecology without an adequate anthropology. When the human person is considered as simply one being among others, the product of chance or physical determinism, then our overall sense of responsibility wanes. Maybe that's why some people abuse the environment. This paradigm leads people to believe that they are free as long as they have the supposed freedom to consume. What is freedom? Freedom to consume. But purchasing, he points out, is always a moral, not simply an economic act. Francis also says, there's also the fact that people no longer seem to believe in a happy future. There's a growing awareness that scientific and technological progress cannot be equated with the progress of humanity. The accumulation of constant novelties exalts a superficiality. Did you get the latest stuff? It becomes difficult to pause and to recover the depth of life. Let us refuse to resign ourselves to this and continue to wonder about the purpose and the meaning of everything. We need to slow down and look at reality in a different way, that constant flood of new consumer goods can baffle the heart and prevent us from cherishing each thing and each moment. It's a return to the capacity to be happy with only a little, which allows us to stop and appreciate the small things. And finally, Francis says, many people know that our current progress and the mere amassing of things and pleasures are not enough to give meaning and joy to the human heart. Yet they feel unable to give up what the market sets before them. Is that us? Is that you? The emptier a person's heart is, the more he or she needs things to buy, own, and consume. Many things need to change, of course, but it is we human beings, above all, who need to change.
Thank you. I'm grateful to be with you today, and thank you to the James Madison Institute program, I should say, and the Aquinas Institute for hosting the event. I was very happy to be a contributor to the book edited by Professor Whaples on the subject of Pope Francis and the caring economy, the caring society. And he's already covered many of the things I think are important about this subject, which obviously goes beyond Pope Francis's particular take on capitalism and embraces the wider question of the relationship between Christian ethics on the one hand and social sciences like economics and economic history on the other. And like Professor Whaples, I'm going to be very careful to state exactly what Pope Francis says. Now, Pope Francis isn't, of course, the first pope to speak dramatically about poverty. In fact, he echoes a long history of Christian reflection on this subject. Archbishop Charles Chaput put it very vividly in his 2014 Erasmus lecture. He said, quote, "If we ignore the poor, we will go to hell. If we blind ourselves to their suffering, we will go to hell. If we do nothing to ease their burdens, then we will go to hell." Archbishop Chaput believes in hell. So does the Pope. And that's all very clear. What's also very clear, for example, Catholic social teaching, is that when it comes to the question of how we help the poor, there's large scope for prudential judgment and disagreement among Christians. There's no, for example, one single Catholic or Christian position on the optimal upper tax rates in a given society. Moreover, informing those prudential judgments, social sciences like economics and economic history have much to contribute, though they are not in themselves decisive when it comes to identifying the optimal policy position, let alone the right moral stance. Economics, after all, is a tool, even a technique, which provides us with certain forms of information, even insights into reality. Economics is especially good at identifying the side effects of our free choices. Now, while relatively few economists would use that type of language, their emphasis upon unintended consequences relies implicitly upon the distinction between the ends and the side effects of the same free choice. As John Finnis observes in his 1998 book, Aquinas, quote, "Modern economics gets going with Adam Smith's proposal that it be undertaken as a science of side effects. Modern economics," he adds, "brings to light the complexity of the impact which one's free choices have beyond their intention or purpose." End quote. Now, of modern economists, I think Wilhelm Röpke, the intellectual architect of the post-war German economic miracle, came closest to saying something similar when he described economics as being about the logic of relationships between the unforeseen side effects of people's choices. He says that this is something that non-economists perhaps find the hardest to understand. Now, none of these considerations settle in any decisive way what ought to be done as a policy or moral matter. But I think they do identify important factors that we and Christian ethics should consider when thinking about how to address poverty. And I do think that more attention to some of the insights offered by economics and economic history would lead to less questionable claims being articulated in various documents, addresses, and speeches of Pope Francis. Now, whereas Professor Whaples focused on Laudato Si', I'm going to be reflecting more upon Pope Francis's 2013 Apostolic Exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium. Now, to be frank, which Francis is always encouraging us to be, some claims made by this document and some of the assumptions underlying those claims are rather questionable. Prominent among these was the Pope's condemnation of, quote, the absolute autonomy of markets. This, he stated, is at the root of many of our contemporary problems, not least because it helps to rationalize an unwillingness to help those in need. If, however, we follow Evangelii Gaudium's injunction to look at realities of the world today, we soon discover that there's literally no country in which markets operate with absolute autonomy. In most Western European countries, for example, governments routinely control an average of 40% of their nation's GDP, well over half of which is spent on welfare. In many developing countries, the percentage is even higher. How much more of the economy do we really want to put in the state's hands? In private correspondence with the Australian economist Colin Clark, even John Maynard Keynes suggested that the figure of, quote, 25% of GDP was the maximum tolerable proportion of taxation advisable. Nor did Evangelii Gaudium appear conscious of just how regulated the world's economies are. So extensive is the range and scope of regulation that, as I've argued elsewhere, I think it's now creating genuine rule of law problems in many countries. The sheer amount of regulation affecting developed Western economies is now so great, and it increased remarkably between 2009 and 2016, that it's likely that even good judges with no interest in judicial activism are issuing rulings that are ad hoc and arbitrary in nature. Another claim made by Evangelii Gaudium that warrants scrutiny is that certain ideologies, quote, reject the rights of states charged with vigilance for the common good to exercise any form of control over the economy, close quote. But outside the minuscule world of anarcho-capitalists, I don't think that's the position of those who favour, for example, free markets today, let alone past advocates like Adam Smith. It's one thing to be sceptical of the effectiveness of various forms of government economic intervention, quite another to reject any form of regulation whatsoever. Now, in other places, such as a 2015 speech to the Global Foundation in Rome, Francis has argued that, quote, a radical capitalist ideology has achieved an ascendancy throughout the world. But can one really claim that a radical economic individualism has achieved a global ascendancy when, for example, government expenditures accounted for 38.9% of America's annual GDP in 2016, almost half of which was on what are called social expenditures? Looking outside developed nations, can it really be said that free market ideas have conquered the Middle East, Africa, or Russia? In fact, crony capitalism, which is of course the polar opposite of free markets, is the norm in numerous countries like Russia. And as far as I can tell, the real issue of cronyism has never been mentioned by Francis. Moreover, until quite recently, many Latin American countries, including of course the Pope's native Argentina, were dominated by the decidedly anti-free market agendas of the left-wing populist governments which came to power in the early 2000s. I've often wondered why the Pope seems reluctant to criticize, for example, the 21st century socialist policies associated with figures like the late Hugo Chavez, which have inflicted economic destruction upon countries like Venezuela. Even in East Asia, where poverty has been radically reduced over the past 40 years, it's a mistake to claim that radical capitalist ideas are ascendant. China's opening to global markets has certainly transformed its living standards for some people. Yet, as observed in the 2016 Index of Economic Freedom, quote, beyond nominal openness to trade and investment, genuinely liberalizing reform measures have not been undertaken, and policies continue to favor the status quo and promotion of the Chinese Communist Party's interests. End quote. Likewise, despite lifting millions out of poverty through openness to trade, India continues to struggle economically. One reason is that India has, as the Index of Economic Freedom states, quote, long-standing institutional shortcomings. A significant gap is, quote, a well-functioning legal and regulatory framework. Another challenge for India, the index adds, is uncertainty about land ownership. This is described as one of the biggest problems facing the Indian economy. In other words, what's missing in many of these countries are one, institutions like rule of law and clear property rights, and two, the cultural settings in which, as John Paul II's Centesimus Annus insisted, markets must be embedded if they're going to work. And it's not hard to find free market economists, many of whom are Christians, who take seriously the gospel's commandment to help the poor, who have focused on how to strengthen such institutions and cultures in countries where they are weak or don't exist. Far from being cheerleaders for a radical capitalist ideology, these thinkers recognize that the capacity of markets to reduce poverty and promote human flourishing and the common good depends on the strength of many non-economic relationships. This is obvious from even casual reading of prominent free market thinkers who also happen to be serious Christians, such as the Nobel economist Vernon Smith. Evangelicalian, to return to that document, also criticized those who, quote, continue to defend trickle-down theories which assume that economic growth encouraged by a free market will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. Such a view, the Pope adds, quote, which has never been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. More generally, the Pope states, quote, we can no longer trust in the unseen forces and the invisible hand of the market, end quote. Well, there are many questions about that type of argument. First of all, opening up markets throughout the world has helped to reduce poverty in many developing nations. East Asia is a living testimony to that reality. A testimony routinely ignored, I find, by many Western European Catholics writing about these issues, and a reality about which I've found many Catholics, when I've been in Latin America, simply have nothing to say. Second, it's never been the argument of most of those who favor markets that economic freedom and economic growth is somehow sufficient to reduce poverty. These things are certainly important, but they're not enough. Among other things, stable governments that provide infrastructure, property arrangements which identify clearly who owns what, and above all, the rule of law are just as essential. It hardly need be said that rule of law, which is not mentioned once in Evangelicalian or Laudato Si, is a challenge in most developing nations. The lack of rule of law not only ranks among the biggest obstacles to their ability to generate wealth on a sustainable basis, it also hampers their capacity to address economic issues in a just manner. Instead, what one finds is the crony capitalism and corruption that's a way of life in much of Africa and Latin America. Far from insisting that the invisible hand, which is a metaphor employed by Adam Smith, which merits an entirely separate discussion in itself, is somehow enough, many market-orientated economists have been underscoring for decades the vital importance of values and institutions in explaining the causes of economic growth and economic decline. Nobel laureate economists such as Edmund Phelps and the late Douglas North have deepened our knowledge of how the values, expectations, beliefs, rules, and informal protocols that define a given economic culture help determine, one, whether a country breaks the bonds of poverty, or two, whether it goes from wealth to seemingly perpetual economic decline, or three, whether it enters a period of prolonged stagnation like Japan since the early 1990s. Lastly, there's the issue of redistribution. In numerous places, Evangelicalium has called for a more equitable distribution of resources within and between societies. Now, of course, Christianity has from the very beginning emphasized that private property is not absolute. It's also affirmed that the state has a role to play in ensuring a more just distribution of wealth. Now, to this, Francis comments that some people today find any mention of the distribution of income to be quote-unquote irksome. Well, personally, I don't find discussions of distribution issues bothersome at all, because it's precisely through such conversations that it can be pointed out that many poverty alleviation methods that involve redistribution, such as foreign aid, have been found wanting. As the economist and historian of the Federal Reserve, the late Alan Meltzer, put it, one of the 20th century's economic lessons is that transfers, grants, and redistribution did little to raise living standards in Asia, Latin America, and Africa. In other words, many of the wealth redistribution policies once regarded as indispensable to poverty alleviation have not achieved their goals. Hence, it behooves us to ask ourselves why such approaches have failed if we're going to have a serious conversation about wealth, poverty, and just ways of redistribution. Now, believe it or not, my comments are by no means intended to imply that all of Pope Francis's observations about economic life are mistaken. His points about consumerism, about envy, etc., are very well taken. As it happens, he also says several things that would resonate with those who favor free markets. The Pope states, for instance, in Evangelicalium that welfare projects should be seen as, quote, temporary responses. He also warns against the, quote, welfare mentality in the same document. Evangelicalium extolled free and creative work. It also affirmed, as Professor Whaples noted, that business is a, quote, noble vocation. It serves the common good by striving to increase the goods of this world and to make them more accessible to all. Equally important was Evangelicalium's reference to the way in which debt and the accumulation of interest make it, quote, difficult for countries to realize the potential of their own economies and keep citizens from enjoying their real purchasing power. And yet, for all these and other observations, it's difficult not to come away from reading Evangelicalium thinking that there are too many unexamined assumptions that made their way into this document. Now, of course, economists, believe it or not, don't agree about everything. And we should also recall that the point of Pope Francis's social teaching and Christian ethics is not to produce an economic treatise. Instead, it serves to point us in the direction of concerns that go far beyond the remit of economics. Concerns for the materially poor, concerns for justice, concerns that Christians fulfill their faith's affirmation that they have non-negotiable obligations to the poor. But, as Francis himself wrote in Evangelicalium, quote, ideas disconnected from realities give rise to ineffectual forms of idealism. And attention, I'd suggest, to particular realities about economic life, particular lessons from economic history, and particular insights into reality offered by economics do seem absent from parts of Francis's reflections upon wealth and poverty. It's my hope that our conversation today will play some role in thinking about how we can encourage a better dialogue between the technique of economic analysis, and the requirements of Christian ethics. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Whaples and Dr. Gregg. Before opening the floor for general conversation, I'd like to put a couple of issues on the table and just permit you to expand your remarks a bit in light of them. The first has to do with the question of what capitalism actually is. Last fall, I had the pleasure of co-teaching a course at Harvard Law School with the brilliant Catholic convert, Professor Adrian Vermeule, and the course looked at the tradition of Catholic social thought going back to its foundations in the 1890s, the early 1890s, with the encyclical letter of Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, written obviously in response to the Industrial Revolution and all of the developments, the movement of people from the countryside into the city, the rise of labor unions, and so forth, all the issues that attended industrialization. And then we took it all the way up to Pope Francis, looking at the encyclicals of Pius XI, Pius XII, John the 23rd, Moderate Magistrate, Paul VI, Populorum Progressio, which is echoed in many ways by the encyclical that you were commenting on, Dr. Gregg. And here's what struck me. Going all the way back to Rerum Novarum and all the way forward through the tradition, there's a strong affirmation of private property, not simply as a prudentially good idea, but as a natural human right. Subject, as Professor Whaples rightly points out, to limitations. It's not an absolute right, but it is nevertheless a natural right. It has real moral force. It cannot simply be dispensed with for utilitarian or other reasons. What else do you have? A very powerful moral condemnation of socialism, the government ownership of the means of production. At the same time, however, you have a strong condemnation of capitalism. At the same time that the encyclical tradition is affirming free markets. Private property, free markets, yes. Socialism, capitalism, no. Now it's easy to see why you reject socialism if you believe in private property and free markets. But what were the popes rejecting, or what did they think they were rejecting when they rejected capitalism? And is there a sense in which there are free market systems that do not qualify or are not subject to are not characterized by whatever the errors are in capitalism? What makes the difference? So can we start with that one, then I have another one for you.
Well, yes, I think that's an accurate summation of the view taken of capitalism by the social encyclical tradition. Basic institutions like private property are considered a natural right, almost an immediate derivation from natural law. Free exchange is affirmed. It's very clear that there are limits upon government action, and the whole principle of subsidiarity is a way of articulating that. But when it comes to what you describe as condemnation of capitalism, the popes have been more specific in some instances than others. So, for example, Pius XI names what he calls Manchesterianism.
Yes, yes.
Manchesterism, which is basically...
And he's writing about 1932.
Right. So he's writing in the middle of the Great Depression, and he's arguing against a school of thought that was associated with the city of Manchester, which is more or less complete laissez-faire. Everything is regulated through property rights. The government has no other role except to enforce contracts, to protect private property rights. At best, it's a night watchman state when it comes to welfare functions.
Would this be something like Ron Paul's libertarianism?
I'm not as familiar with Ron Paul's thought as I am with Catholic social teaching, but there are certainly people who describe themselves as on the free market spectrum who would more or less articulate that line of thinking. And I think the condemnation of that has much to do with what you might call the underlying philosophy and the underlying anthropology of the human person that's operative. What's operative in, if you might call it, that way of thinking, utilitarianism, is very clearly what's at work in that way of thinking about the world, which in turn reflects a particular understanding of the human person. Human persons are simply utility maximizers. The purpose of life is pleasure. You maximize pleasure, you minimize pain. It's very Benthamite, it's very James Mill, John Stuart Mill, etc. And the critique is partly one of institutions in the sense that the Catholic tradition and natural law, I would say, has a more expansive view of what the state can and cannot do in these areas. But more fundamentally, I think it's the vision, the underlying vision that's informing that way of thinking about the economy. And you find this more or less articulated in Centesimal Annals, where that famous paragraph, I think it's paragraph 42, where St. John Paul II distinguishes between a capitalism that affirms property rights, free exchange, entrepreneurship, business, etc., and on the other hand, it says if capitalism means a sort of radical individualism, then it's clearly not compatible. So if you like, the Catholic social teaching has a very nuanced approach to capitalism and capitalisms, but it does stand as a pretty big contrast to the way that socialism, and even more so communism, are treated. They're clearly out of balance, full stop. And what we seem to be arguing about are what type of capitalism or what type of free economy what type of economic arrangements that affirm some of the institutions that you just described, which come closer to affirming these basic truths about the human person that we find in Christian anthropology.
Everything you say, I recognize as being condemned in those encyclicals. That does seem to be much of what's meant by capitalism. But there seems to be something else, and I wonder if I'm right or wrong about this in your view. The something else is concentrations of wealth that are made possible by the use of money to make money. In other words, where wealth becomes completely unconnected to labor as such, and just wealth itself is used to generate more wealth, which can be used to generate more wealth, leading to enormous concentrations, which translate into, of course, inequalities of political power, as well as inequalities of wealth, and create what, from the contemporary point of view, might be condemned not as capitalism, but as plutocracy. Am I right to see that in there?
To an extent, yes. One thing that's missing, which is to your point, which is missing, I think, from the Catholic social tradition of thinking about these things, there's actually very little written about finance and banking. Very, very little. In fact, it's today the 8th, in 9 days' time, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is issuing a statement, a document on financial ethics. I think this is the first time a congregation of that level has ever addressed this particular subject. And one of the reasons I think they're doing so is because it reflects a lacuna in the tradition, thinking about this question of what some people would call the financialization of the economy. That's the expression we've heard in more recent times to describe the phenomenon that you're talking about, whereby the financial system gets detached from serving its purpose, which is to provide capital so that the rest of the economy has fuel to run on. And in my book, For God and Profit, I talk about this, and I say that this is really something that's missing. And to the extent that the magisterium talks about it, it's a little bit of a caricature. So I'm not sure they've really thought very seriously at the level that's required about this question of the role of capital and what the accumulation of capital does, both in terms of some of the problems that you're describing, but also the fact that if we don't accumulate capital, you're not going to be accumulating enough type of resources that capitalist systems need if they're going to be operating in the first place.
Right. So the accumulation of capital is necessary if capitalism is to generate the,
absolutely,
is to lift people out of poverty the way it has in India and in China. And
this is the genius of Alexander Hamilton, when he more or less designed the financial system of this country, he understood that if you want to have a dynamic capitalist economy, you must have this type of financial system that allows for the accumulation of wealth, that allows for the accumulation of capital that you need if you're going to have the fuel that we all need, not just banks and financial houses, but everyone needs whenever we need to go and get a loan.
Of course, the other concern, which I should have mentioned, that it's all over the encyclicals, especially the early ones, is the exploitation of labor.
Sure.
Did you have anything, Professor Whaples, to say, or should I go to the next?
I want to say, I want to throw a radical thought out, and that is that the teachings here could be mirrored by teachings on marriage and sexuality. Okay? Socialism is obviously wrong. Communism is obviously wrong. Shacking up is obviously wrong. Same-sex marriage is obviously wrong in Catholic teaching. Capitalism can be right. Marriages can be right, but you have to do it right within them. And so there are some things that are clearly out of bounds, and there are some things that are in bounds, but how you do it.
Well, then you have a semantic issue,
Yeah.
because those early encyclicals do reject capitalism. Right, so
Yeah.
what you can do right
Yeah.
is a free market economy.
In that sense, I guess probably just a difference in how people are defining the term. Certainly how the economy, I gave my definition of capitalism up front. It's just basically sort of a textbook definition that most economists would use. And I think that would be within the bounds of what Reverend Barron says.
And so, Sam, I gather what you're saying is that if it's a kind of von Mises type pure libertarian laissez-faire
Oh, that's clearly
system,
problematic.
if that's what you mean by capitalism, that's condemned.
Well, certainly that's what
But
the
if
encyclicals make that
but
very
if it's a system where the right of the state, the authority of the state to regulate the economy for the sake of protecting workers from exploitation, protecting public health, safety, and morals, upholding the common good, that can still be capital. You can still use, if you assign the word capitalism to that, that's not being, that capitalism.
Right, and all those things you just described are all regulated, if you might say, by the principle of subsidiarity.
Subsidiarity.
And what's really important about that principle, I often...
Well, let me just say what the principle is. So the principle of subsidiarity is the principle that where power is exercised, it should be exercised at the lowest possible level, closest to the people over whom it's exercised. Where decisions have to be made, they should be made low down, close into the people who are subject, whose lives are affected by the decision, and not far away, unless it's necessary to shift it up. So if something can be handled by the individual, let the individual handle it. If it can't be handled by the individual, but it can by the family, let the family handle it. If it can't by the family, but it can by the neighborhood, let the neighborhood handle it. If it can't by the neighborhood, but could by the larger political unit, do that. And if it can only be handled by the central state, then the central state legitimately handles it.
The only thing I would add to that is that it's often seen as a sort of crypto-federalism. It's often seen as, well, this is the efficient way that you do things. But actually the real point of subsidiarity is the importance of people needing to make free choices. You can't flourish as a person, you can't flourish as a community, unless you're making free choices. And so subsidiarity tries to combine respect for the need for people to make free choices with the subsidium, the assistance that all of us need at different points of our lives from the communities that you belong to. And subsidiarity is a principal way of thinking about how you balance those two things, which are often very difficult.
But by free choices, you don't mean a license for laissez-faire or libertarianism. So free choices among reasonable, good, morally good options.
Well, of course, the assumption that's operating here in all these documents is the vision of Christian anthropology, that we're free, and we're free to live lives of flourishing, and when we don't do that, we do this thing called sin. So the vision of freedom that informs these documents is not just negativity.
Okay, maybe we can handle this second one more quickly. It has to do with the success of capitalism. It does work. No question it works, and it has had some wonderful effects like lifting people out of poverty. But this graph does speak for itself. right? And if we look at those ads, whether they're for Lexuses or smartphones or Match.com, or it's always this material thing that's really going to make you happy. I think there's no denying that it's built into the capitalist system that we incentivize ourselves as producers and sellers to persuade people that what we have to offer them is really, really important. That this matters, and it's going to make you happy, and it's going to make your life better. And it would be crazy to think that that's not going to be exaggerated in the nature of things and get out of control. So how can spiritual values be maintained? How can this
This
be
should be
prevented
the
from
highest priority of everybody, as far as I'm concerned, right? And so I've actually collected some of these data. The Pew has done it in a couple ways. I've pulled them together. I've done some simple regression analysis on it. And it's interesting kind of seeing these, it's not causation, but the correlations between these things. One thing I found was that for each year that a country spends under communism, the percentage of people who say that religion is very important to them drops by 0.4%. A decade will knock 4 points off you. If you're under for 70 years, like some countries.
So that explains why Russia is down
yeah,
here. Yeah.
exactly. Actually, the percent Muslim in the country gives you a boost in the percent
In religiosity.
that they're very religious. And putting in the characteristics of the United States, and including, you know, our income level, if you were to move the United States back to the middle of the pack, the simple regression would say we get an extra 14% of the population who would report being that religion was very important to them. Again, correlation, not necessarily causation, but it's hard to make a story where it's mere correlation and not some causation. Proverbs, after all, warned us about this, right? Giving neither poverty or riches. And so this is something we need to think about individually.
There is that business about the rich man and the eye of the needle.
True.
Now, I think we rightly interpret that story as not having exclusively to do with
Yeah.
material riches. I think that's right. But it's not that it has nothing to
Yeah.
do with material riches. Okay, I'm going to open the floor. I see someone itching to get into the conversation. Now, wait just a second, because she's going to hand you a microphone, and this way we'll catch what I'm sure will be an excellent question on tape.
I don't know about that. At the risk of actually oversimplifying all of this, isn't the real issue that the Catholic Church has is the issue of corruption, be it in a socialist society, a communist society, a capitalist society? And to me, the issue that I think we all struggle with, irregardless of our economic system or religious beliefs, but how do you contain the corruption of power? So when you have, when you are overindulged, even listening about Eric Schneiderman today and the understanding of, if you're given this position of authority, you abuse it. Whether you're a union leader or an attorney general, that to me is at the heart of the problem here.
Or you might add, and within the church itself, I mean, look at the so far still unsuccessful efforts to reform the Vatican Bank, despite Francis's very firm, aggressive statement at the beginning of his pontificate that the bank's going to be reformed. What do you say?
So first, this is something that we all need to deal with as individuals. And when we are put into positions of power, we have to make sure that we don't abuse them and live up. And I think most of the people in the room are very intelligent, very successful. And when you are, they just hand you more and more power. And you've got to inoculate yourself against that. And to me, the greatest thing on an individual level to do this is to go back and read something like Thomas à Kempis, Imitation of Christ. If you want to make yourself a more, humble person, read something like that. But it can't just be individuals. It's got to be something we do collectively that we share with each other. That's one of the purposes of the church. That's one of the purposes of a lot of other organizations. But to just
fan the flames of that. I have no great answers. But we are in dire need of it.
Well, for better or worse, I mean, the tradition, going back to urban environment, now forward to the encyclicals on which our guests are commenting today, the tradition definitely does not think that the problem is just with corruption, it's not with the systems, that if you had people who weren't corrupt, you could really choose pretty much arbitrarily among the systems and everything would be okay. That's not it.
Yep.
I mean, the tradition is very clear. Socialism, no. Communism, triple, no. Capitalism, whatever it is, sorry, no. Free markets, regulated properly for the sake of the common good, protecting against the exploitation of labor, yes, that's good. So it's not, the church tradition itself is more than just corrupt. The problem is more than just corruption. Professor James was one of our nation's most distinguished historians of economics.
So, thanks. It's a really illuminating discussion. I wondered, though, I think something Sam said right at the end is vital, that economists don't really agree on many things, including many of the statements here lined out in the original economic manifesto, as it were. And I wanted to highlight two things in particular. One is that capitalism, it seems to me, is changing in its meaning all the time, and it's something that is evolving very quickly. So if you think of the 19th century story that Robbie started with Rarum Novarum, in that period, capitalism was very clearly meant, I think, as what Sam talked about as financialization. That big industrialists would often say they're not capitalists, the capitalists are the bankers, because the industrialists are doing things and making things, but the capitalists are outside. And so I think the point right at the end that critical issue is about financialization and about our attitude to that. And I think the story of a kind of radical, very speeded up individualism that then spreads into all kinds of other sectors of life. You know, there's a really interesting section on that in Patrick Deneen's book. You know, how the financial sector is a model for personal life, and sort of speed dating and inconsistency in relationships comes from a very short-term vision that is being projected in this kind of overall dominance of the financial system. And you know, it's an area you don't need to be terribly radical. Paul Volcker goes along in this line and says, you know, there's an awful lot of so-called financial innovation that is just not very productive, and it's been disrupted. And the second area that I thought you might really be more sympathetic to Pope Francis is on is the question of the environment, and in particular the way that we deal with externalities, because it is possible to price many things, and obviously that's the right solution to deal with this, but the existing proposals and existing mechanisms, carbon taxes, have just been very ineffective at doing that, and there are really perverse circumstances in which you say rightly that there are we're not running out of resources. That's absolutely right, but with the carbon story, it's exactly the problem that if you think at some point in the future we may be in such a bad situation that we need to restrict the carbon emissions completely, then you create a price fall and you create an enormous incentive to burn the stuff today. And so, all of us go to conferences and we drive big cars and so on. And that's a reaction. It's a price signal that is doing that. And that's something where the price system itself is not working. So if you think of Nicholas Stern is kind of absolutely in the same boat as Pope Francis. And the last time I had a conversation with Nicholas Stern, almost the first thing he said was Pope Francis says this. And it seems to me that they're absolutely right on this one, and that they should get more kudos for that.
Sam?
I'll leave the environmental question to Professor Whaples, because I know he knows a lot about that. Let me say something about capitalism. Professor Whaples mentioned that it emerged as a type of expletive, almost, as a way of assaulting people. That's true. It's also a Marxist word. We shouldn't forget that Marx is really the one who popularizes the term Das Kapital. He's the one that popularizes the term, which means it gets invested with, I think, some very questionable anthropological assumptions, very questionable economics. And it's also very reflective of the conditions of 19th century industrial Europe. There's some things we need to think about in that regard. I mean, Professor Whaples mentioned people, actually it was Professor George who mentioned people leaving the countryside and going to the cities. Well, why did they go to the cities?
Jobs.
Life was better. They were moving
Although
themselves.
often they got surprised.
Oh, sure, but they were moving themselves away from semi-feudal, peasant-like situations where they're living and dying by the age of 30 for the most part. They're moving to places, into cities, which are not particularly pleasant places, that's true. But they're also finding that they're living longer, that their health is improving all the time. There's a famous debate between the Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, who to his day he's died was claiming that 20 million people was worth it if the Soviet Union succeeded. And an Australian economic historian named Max Hartwell at Oxford. And they were arguing about the actual effect of industrial capitalism upon these sort of general measures of well-being. And Hartwell, I think, pretty much proved conclusively that there are a lot of myths about 19th century capitalism. And I think some Catholics, and this to a certain extent is reflected a little bit in some of the historical observations that the Catholic encyclical tradition has of the 19th century that absorb some of these myths. We think about the novels of Charles Dickens, for example. These are terrible images of what we imagine a lot of industrial Europe was like. And a lot of it was like that. But there's another side to this story of industrial capitalism that I think remains relatively unappreciated by many people working in Christian social networks.
Do any of our students have any questions?
Let me
you want
actually
to
respond
respond?
to, especially the Stern comment, and implicitly the question there was one of impatience, right? What should the discount rate be? If we're going to set a carbon tax, if you set it down at 0, it would be a huge carbon tax. And I had 12 points for both sides, 12 being a nice Christian number to use. But I could easily have added a 13th or more. And one of them would have been a critique that says that capitalism markets encourage people to be impatient. Don't they always, right? You've got to have it now. And so what would be the optimal discount rate, the rate at which we discount future damages? I think on a moral Christian basis, we should be patient. We should be patient if we're moral people. That would say we should have a very low discount rate in making these calculations.
But in so many ways, the capitalist system, the market system, does disincentivize slowing down or waiting. Just look at the career prospects of corporation executives. What they need to show is greater shareholder value over shorter periods of time, and then get out and move to the next firm, and catastrophe may be kicked down the road, but it'll be somebody else's problem.
So there would
That's structural.
Yes, there would be an economist rebuttal to that 13th point, and it would be that there is also a lot within the system that encourages people to think long term, right? But especially, I was thinking of the consumers wanting, forever, have it now. Whereas to be flourishing as a producer, you do have to make the investment now and wait for the payoff later, encouraging a long term.
In fact, the payoff may not come 10 or 15 years. And you take a lot of risks in the use.
Students? Any student questions? You're sitting quietly. You're a senior student. Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, there's no doubting that capitalism has made tremendous contributions to the world and to society. But as a somewhat student of Rerum Novarum and some of the encyclicals that popes wrote, I take it sort of as I think the professor has mentioned, not as a condemnation of capitalism, nor a espousing of government and government intervention in totality, but rather looking for a balance between what should be in the long term important to humans. Now, I don't know if any of you have had the chance to walk in the slums of India, or China, or Mexico City, or Argentina, or Venezuela, because it was mentioned, Chavez, then perhaps in the United States. I have. And what I see there is that when so-called capitalism is taken to an extreme, it can be detrimental to the population at large. And somebody needs to step in. And since the Professor Whaples mentioned in the beginning of his talk the issue of somebody finding gold and using it as a doorstop. Now it turns out in Peru, there still is a lot of gold. And on the border of Peru and in Brazil, there's quite a bit of gold. And a lot of people find it, most of them poor, and they try to take advantage of that resource. And traditionally, gold has been refined by mercury. You mix it, and then you vaporize it. And people were making economic gains from it, but until somebody stepped in and said, that mercury vapor is causing damage to the brains and to the perpetuation of those lives, it didn't stop. I don't even know if it has stopped. So while I look at the intent of saying that what the Pope has written seems to be a condemnation of capitalism, I don't see it in that regard. And you've got to remember that the Pope is a product of Argentina. And he did stand up, and I know people who saw him, I did not see him, although I've seen some videos of it, where he was condemning the power structure in Argentina. Most people don't know, but the Argentinian government back in, they call it the Plains War, wiped out all the Native Americans, Native Argentinians, and made a lot of power because it was an economic resource to have sheep when wool was important. So in any case, not to prolong this, but if we read the Jungle, up in St. Clair's The Jungle, and you talked about what industrialism was or wasn't. The FDA, I think, came out of The Jungle, and the story about how food was manufactured, and the government had to stand in. So I think that in this discussion, it bears looking at what the Pope is saying and perhaps examining what is valid there and how do we balance that with what appears to be we're going towards unbridled or less bridled, less regulation. Because we got to remember that when we have less regulation, the Erie River caught on fire and Tokyo Bay caught on fire. And it took government regulation to control that for the common good.
Well, I suppose everyone is going to say it all depends on the merits of each claim about regulation. That each claim that this doesn't so ought to be regulated and regulated in this way or that way has got to stand or fall on the merits. What the tradition, I think what everybody has affirmed the tradition says, is that regulations are legitimate when they uphold public health, safety, and morals, prevent exploitation, and enhance the common good. So there's that's the rejection of what Leo XIII had in mind about capitalism was unregulated markets. Now the question is, what are good regulations and what are counterproductive or bad regulations? Do you want to say something, Sean?
I think we're way too overregulated.
Overregulated.
I think that's actually, we don't have a problem with underregulation in the United States or Western Europe. We are overrun with regulations. If you talk to any business person, they'll tell you how difficult it's become, particularly since 2000. Since the financial crisis, it's gotten worse. We have pages and pages of regulation added to statute books in Western Europe and North America. Now, you mentioned Latin America. I've spent quite a bit of time in Latin America, and you mentioned Argentina. And Mexico. What I've found in those countries is what's lacking, and I think I mentioned this in my remarks, it's institutions. You can go in parts of Buenos Aires, for example, which is, if you go to Buenos Aires, on the one hand, it's this beautiful Parisian-like city, late 19th century Parisian city. And then you go 1 mile to your left or to your right, and you're in the Whaples. And what's interesting about all this is that people don't know who owns what. And that creates problems, because if I don't know what I own, if I don't know where the boundary is between my neighbor and myself, or I don't have a bank account which shows me how much capital I have, I am not going to get out of poverty. And it seems to me that in many developing countries, that's where some of these discussions have to start. Because without those institutions, what do people do? They gravitate towards something that's been mentioned here, power. So economic success in countries like Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, all these places, economic success is heavily dependent upon access to government power. That's why so many Central American economies, who runs them? About 5 families in most of these countries, and guess what? They all are either related to the president or they're strong supporters of the president.
That just is cronyism.
Yeah, it's
Right?
cronyism. And what's
Yeah.
interesting, I find, is that Catholic social teaching doesn't say much about the subject. I've written some articles about this, saying this is an issue it's clearly unjust. If there's any economic system that's clearly unjust in today's world, it's cronyism, and the church really hasn't said too much about that. And I'm not sure it's always understood how big government can often enable that. There's a reason why the 610 richest counties in the United States are where?
Right near Washington.
Outside Washington, D.C., which produces? Right, so cronyism is alive. Cronyism is alive and well in developed economies as well. And it's not just an economic issue, it's clearly a justice question, which I don't think the magisterium, for example, has yet to deal with in the systematic way that's required.
At the risk of going over, this gentleman has had his hand up from the very beginning, and I want to give you a chance to ask your question.
Thank you. Professor Whaples, you remind me a little bit of my early economics classes in college. And by that I mean what you're talking about is what I would consider somewhat static economics. There's nothing wrong with what you said. I agree with what you said. I can understand the Pope's responses to what you said. But it seems to me that you have left out behavioral economics. When you talk in here, the example is when you talk about mobility, all right? My son and my daughter-in-law would love to move, but they can't because their family is here, because they have jobs where they have commitments to. And if they move, they would to a certain extent be starting all over again without their families, without their support group, without their friends. And moving, at least in 2018, is an extremely difficult thing to do. And as a result, I can tell you my daughter-in-law really feels that she is being exploited because her boss knows that. And, so I'm just interested in your perspective on that and why I never heard the word behavioral.
And so there's a lot of subcomponents of what you said that I need to answer. And the first is, I have actually tried explicitly not to take a static approach. I began with a very dynamic approach about how when we do get this set of incentives right, it produces a lot of new technology and economic growth and that. And I guess there's a lot of studies that have been done lately by economists that point out that one of the main reasons behind our lack of mobility, geographic mobility, is regulations that have been put in place that make it so expensive for people to move to the most productive areas in the country, say the Silicon Valley area or up to New York City. There's so much undeveloped land or there's so much potential to build taller apartments and those kinds of things, but they just zone it so that you can't do that. And back in the old days, people did move to opportunity. Now it's harder to move to opportunity. But then the behavioral question, behavioral economics is a rapidly developing field with, I think, a lot of applications. But I just don't have, I just haven't found as many insights from it maybe as other economists have. And I think it's because I make a general assumption about individuals that most non-behavioral economists make. And that is that people are rational. That is an audacious assumption, but I believe that it is grounded in theology, that God created people as rational in his own image. And so, well, there may be some particulars where that is incorrect. In the broad scheme of things, I believe it is fundamentally correct that people are rational. We do have some little short circuits in our brains that lead us to make some foolish decisions. And they do get exploited at the margin, I think, by some sellers. They lock you into some long-term contract you didn't want to get into, you sign up for the gym and you never go, that kind of thing. But in the grander scheme of things, I just don't think that it's as important as the broader assumption of rationality. That's my take.
Can I just add one point to that? One of the areas of hope I see for constructive conversation between Christian ethics, natural law, and economics is that there are so many subdisciplines of economics now that take things like values, beliefs, very seriously. It doesn't necessarily mean they're making a normative judgment about these things. But there's, for example, institutional economics takes the view that the value commitments that people make can be embedded in institutions, and it's foolish to ignore these things when you're thinking about the type of economic order that you want to live in. Traditionally, for a long time, economists and economics shied away from that type of question because you couldn't measure it. And if something doesn't measure, and some economists will say it doesn't exist. But I think there are many economists now who are expanding beyond what, let's call it, the positive dimension, there's a positivistic dimension of economics, and are taking normative questions much more seriously, and frankly in a way that's much more true